Welcome back to Maximum Attack Rallying and to part 2 of my RS2000 retrospective, let's call it, because it's not a build series because I built it years ago and I don't own it anymore. If you've watched the first video already, you will know that we've kind of looked back on the history of the car, how I came to own it and its various evolutions before I owned it, from kind of near standard blue Mark V RS2000 through blue and yellow wide arch thing to white wide arch thing with Mark VI bits, and then me buying it. So if you haven't watched that, do go back and watch it, because some of this might not make that much sense if you haven't. So that's part 1. Part 2 is, how can we put part 2? Part 2 is kind of where things went a bit off the rails. So the original plan with this car was just to keep it simple. I said this in episode 1, didn't I? It was just a case of buy the car and drive the car. That was the point of it. You know, it was everyone says that when you're starting out in rallying that you should just buy a car rather than trying to build a car yourself. And I get that. I do understand why people say that, because in theory it is easier, isn't it? You buy a car, it should be kind of ready to go, even if you end up doing a few minor little bits. For me, I don't know if that rings true. I think maybe I'm just fussy. I don't know. Every time I look at a rally car that isn't mine or that I haven't kind of messed with, I just end up staring at it thinking, I'd change that. No, I'd change that. And that kind of happened with this one. So, yes, there were a few plans. So I bought the car as it was. As I said in part 1, mechanically it was pretty standard, slightly wider track with different lower arms, extended steering, track rods and Group A top mounts and a few bits and pieces. But the engine was basically standard apart from the exhaust. It was a standard gearbox apart from Quake diff, and I just thought there's a couple of things I could do to just make it a little bit better. And one of those was the brakes. So the car had standard RS2000 brakes, so discs on the back, discs on the front. I think the front discs on an RS2000 are only 260mm. They're okay, and that's it. So I thought one thing I can do is upgrade the brakes. So that was the first port of call, and to do that I needed to fit bigger wheels because it only had 15-inch wheels, and a lot of the wheels that came with it were standard forward wheels, so not the best for brake clearance. So I got a couple of Speedline 17-inch wheels and I bolted them to the car, and as you're going to see from these pictures, that exposed the first problem. So as I said before, the wide arches were from a trailer, a set of mud guards that someone had cut kind of lengthways all the way around. And they'd use that to kind of tack on these kind of wide arches. They didn't look great, but I was kind of willing to put up with them until you can see that the way that they've been fitted, they weren't actually centered on the axle line at all. So the tyres ended up really, really close to the arches. So that wasn't going to cut it. That was a problem. I toyed back and forth with sticking with 15-inch wheels, but I was determined to fit bigger wheels. So there was that. And the real thing that prompted this kind of all getting a bit out of control was there was a couple of little wiring issues with the car at one point, a couple of earths and things. Nothing major. It was just stuff that happens with an old car, isn't it? You know, it was an old car to begin with, 30-year-old wiring, or 25-year-old wiring as it was, and you know it's been messed around with, its wires added and things like that, and you just start to find a few little problems. And in trying to solve those problems, whilst trying to clean up the interior a bit, I found that the bulkhead area was quite rusty, which is, I mean, I've had a lot of Escorts of that generation, and I've never seen one as bad as that. They usually go in the battery tray area, and this one was okay there because that had been done before, but this was kind of the middle of the bulkhead, kind of under where the wiper motor goes, and it was bad. And unfortunately, really to do that properly, it was going to be a bit more of a stripped down dashboard out, potentially even engine out. So you can tell what's coming here, can't you? We went from let's buy a car and change the brakes and wheels to okay, we're taking the engine out. So yeah, we took the engine out, and I thought, well, if we're taking the engine out, we might as well repaint the engine bay, and if we're repainting the engine bay, we might as well do under the wheel arches and things. And it escalated to the point that the car basically became a body shell. So I took, what did I leave on the car? The fuel tank didn't come off, and the rear axle didn't come off. Pretty much every single other part came off. So it ended up as a body shell. So that is partly down to this issue of obviously needing to fix the rust. Actually, as it turns out, through doing all of that, I ended up taking everything out of the interior, taking all the obviously side skirts and everything came off. And at that point, we actually discovered that there was still quite serious rust in the sill on the passenger side, left-hand side. That would be the driver's side if you're not in the UK. So basically, where the foot of the roll cage had been welded in, it had never been sealed properly, and the sill and the floor had all rotted out. And that, if there'd been an impact on that side, that would have been a big problem. So ultimately, stripping it down was probably a good thing, because it did result in that being fixed, and it meant I could right some bits of the car that I didn't particularly like, and there were a few of those which I think we should probably talk about now. So I think I don't want to come across like I'm moaning about anyone. As I said, I bought the car from a friend of mine, Mike, and he'd done a good job on the bits he'd done. He refreshed the exterior of the car, made some changes mechanically in terms of kind of maintenance and things, and the car was much better when he sold it to me than when he bought it. But as I said, it's just one of those things. It was a relatively old car. It had been a rally car for a long time, and things just get added to and changed, don't they? And things kind of pile up. And I'm quite fussy. My degree was in automotive engineering. I was working in the motorsport industry at this time as an engineer, so I was quite fussy. I was exposed to kind of F1 and world endurance type stuff in my day job, and obviously being a rally fan and being around the sport, obviously you spend a lot of time with world rally cars and things, and you kind of get used to pro-built cars, and I was just fussy. There was things about the car I didn't like. Inside, for example, lots of that stick-on tar type bitumen sound deadening hadn't been removed. The paint inside was kind of brush painted on. It was just bits and pieces, there was lots of stuff in the car that should have been stripped out to save weight but hadn't been, for example, and just bits that I think could have been done better, or could have been made lighter, or could have been made neater, could have been made easier to work on. So this is kind of how it escalated. And so basically what I ended up doing, so I started with the engine bay, stripped everything out of the engine bay, fixed the bulkhead rust, fixed the stitch welded all inside the engine bay, inside the car, all of that stuff that hadn't been done to begin with, because it was obviously quite a basic build, and kind of built from there. And because the car had been so stripped back, obviously the trailer mudguards, which had caused the problem with the brakes, it was like, well, if we're going this far, let's sack those off. This is extreme, isn't it? So I had actually wanted to go back to standard wheel arches on the car, at least on the rear, and maybe have some slightly flared, standard looking kind of fronts, a bit like an early Group A RS2000 where the fronts were just stretched a little bit. So that was what I'd originally kind of thought about doing. But the problem with that was at the rear, so I don't think I've got any pictures of this, unfortunately, but where the standard arches had been cut back, and the mudguard had kind of been wedged between the inner kind of wheel arch and the outer wheel arch, and then kind of tacked together, and it was a bit messy. So by the time we'd cut all of that off, putting factory wheel arches in was just going to be a real nightmare. So that was a bit of a no-go. So in the end, I just decided to go with the Cosworth style kind of fiberglass over fenders, we call them. People call them these days, don't they? But they're kind of wheel arch extensions. So I cleaned up the wheel arches as best I could, welded the two skins together and made it kind of solid and strong, and then just put a pretty fiberglass panel over the outside of it. Front end, just cut the original steel wings off with the mudguard bits and just put fiberglass Escort Cosworth wings on. And that was that. So that is probably the most dramatic visual change I did to the car, apart from painting it yellow, because that really changed the look of it. It made it look kit car-ish or something. I mean, it probably isn't quite. I mean, a kit car is wider than an Escort Cosworth, even the one without the kind of maxi arches. And this wasn't quite as wide as that, because I tried to keep the arches pulled in as much as possible at the rear to make it look a bit more standard. So that changed the look of the outside of the car in a big way. Inside was much more simple. Obviously kept the roll cage as it was. I did end up putting new seats in, new seat rails, but I kept a lot of the interior as it was. I just stripped everything back. All the sound deadening finally came out. The dashboard, I cut big chunks out of it. So it was just a lot of trimming it back to try and get the car as light as I could. Other things that happened inside the car, ended up getting a completely brand new wiring loom, because that was like 25-year-old standard Ford stuff that had been cut about for spotlights and things. So my friend Matt made me a new loom. We had a carbon fibre centre console from an Escort F2 car in there, flock dash that I'd got. So it was just about cleaning it up. You know, I trimmed the steering column, for example, got rid of all the little brackets off it, and took the factory heater and everything out and just put a little lightweight heater in there to save weight. So it was just an exercise in removing as much weight from the car as possible and just trying to tidy it up, make it clean, you know, repainted it all inside with a spray gun to make it better. So there was lots and lots that happened visually and kind of inside that made the car look really, really different to when I bought it. And I think it actually turned out all right. I decided to paint the car yellow because I thought, you know, I'm going to end up painting the whole car anyway. I ummed and ahed about just keeping it white, but I thought, you know what, I'm going to put a bit of a spin on it, do something different. I actually toyed with the idea of painting it that fluorescent yellow with orange bumpers that Gwyndaf Evans used in the early part of '97. But I decided against that simply because the paint was really, really expensive, and that paint fades really badly if the car ever sits outside. So I just went with, I think it was forward signal yellow in the end. I just thought they would give it a new look and kind of make it mine, if that makes sense. So that was the kind of visuals of the car. As I said in the last video, if you do have any specific questions about things I did, do let me know. Just drop them in the comments and I'll try and answer. I tried to make the car kind of as good as I reasonably could in terms of fit and finish. I did all of this on my driveway at home, so that's why, you know, the paint job was done at home, so it wasn't like a pro job. But I just tried to make the car kind of a step on in terms of fit, finish, just the way things were done, the way things were put together to just keep it light and simple, easy to work on, and just look a bit better, really. So that was that, and I think inside and outside it ended up looking pretty good, which hopefully the pictures you're seeing right now will show you. So all of that leads us on to the mechanical stuff. I made a decision with the project pretty early on to kind of leave the engine alone. That was partly because of budget. I didn't have the money to do forged pistons and throttle bodies and things, and I kind of wanted to focus on other bits of the car. I thought the engine can come later. You know, let's get the fundamentals right, you know, get the body better, get the interior better, and, you know, an engine can come later. So obviously the engine came out to do the bodywork, to do the engine bay. So with that, it was just a case of clean it up, paint it, make it look pretty, replace a few seals because it had a couple of minor oil leaks, and that was that. The big thing I did want to change was the gearbox. So anyone who's done club rallying will know, if you try and do it in a standard car, that the big compromise is always the gearbox, because production cars are kind of they're geared for economy, aren't they? And I think the RS2000 had a theoretical top speed of 160 or 170 miles an hour because the gearing is so long. Obviously the engine doesn't have anywhere near enough power to get it there, but so that meant, you know, on events where you're doing 100 mile an hour maximum, the gearing was terrible. And the problem with the Escort is that there isn't really much available for it. The MTX75 that it uses was Ford's high power gearbox for the front wheel drive cars at that time, and the Escort fitment was relatively unique. Later ones it was used in the Focus and the Mondeo, so that gearbox was used a lot, but it was a slightly different version. So the Escort uses a rod linkage, whereas Focus and Mondeo use cables, and the mounts are all different. So there wasn't much about, you know, the problem is the externals of the gearbox are slightly different, but the internals are slightly different. So you can't fit Focus internals into an Escort casing, for example. I found a company in the US who made a gear kit for the Focus gearbox. It replaced third, fourth and fifth gear. It was from M Factory. So it was about £600 at the time. So much better than £3,000 or £4,000 for a Quaife gear kit. And I managed to get hold of one through Grinspeed up in Leyland. They were really, really helpful and managed to import one for me. I think you can now get M Factory stuff much more easily in the UK, but at this time you couldn't. So that, for me, was a really good solution, because for a few £100 I could get the gearing down. So I did some calculations, and those M Factory gears and a Focus gearbox would make the gearing pretty much spot on. You know, first and second were okay as standard, but third, fourth and fifth, he brought it right down. So I think the top speed was going to be about 115 miles an hour. So absolutely bang on. The problem was getting the Focus gearbox to fit in the car. I'd already decided to use a Group A engine mount, because the standard Escort engine mount is a bit flaky. It's kind of behind the engine and isn't very good. So that was was fitted, the engine and gearbox, they actually went together fine. So I used a Focus diesel gearbox because it has a front mounted starter motor. So it bolted up to the RS2000 engine perfectly. It looked like the clutch and flywheel were going to be fine. Turns out they weren't, but it looked like they were. And it all slotted into the car okay. We had to make custom mounts because the Focus only has 2 gearbox mounts. It has one at the top and one at the bottom rear, whereas the RS2000 I think has, hold on, one at the bottom rear, one at the top rear, and one at the top front. So it has 3. So that required custom gearbox mounts making, which I've got some pictures of so you can see a bit of that. So if by chance you are thinking about doing this yourself, you can kind of see what goes into it. So once we'd done that, it all fitted into the car. I mean, people had told me that the Focus gearbox wouldn't even fit into an Escort. They said that it would hit the chassis rails, but that isn't actually true. So physically it all fits, you just have to make custom mounts, and I had to have custom drive shafts because my car's a wider track. So it was a bit of a faff in that respect, but it did all go in, and in theory it should have all worked. We did have a problem in that the clutch and flywheel didn't work, so we measured everything up, and the thickness of the clutch and the flywheel in the Escort comparative to a Focus looked identical, but for some reason it wouldn't work. It wouldn't properly engage, so it kept losing drive. The clutch would just slip, so we had to switch to a Focus flywheel and clutch. But it was a lot of work. It took a long time with all the fabrication of the mounts, and I think I had to wait 3 months for the drive shaft. So it turned into a bit of a saga, but I would say it was probably the single best thing that I did to the car. Obviously, you know, it was nice making the car look better and making it a bit cleaner and lighter, but it drove completely differently. You know, with the cable shift, you know, that allowed me to move the gear lever up in the car, which you'll see in the interior pictures, and I could fine tune the driving position a little bit, and the shift was really nice, and you know, we managed to get the gearing right down to the car. Even though the engine was standard, the car felt a lot quicker. So that was probably the biggest mechanical improvement that I made for sure. As I said, engine remained 100% standard. The suspension remained largely as it was, so I did pull the rear track in a little bit because we'd narrowed the rear of the body of the car. The front end, I kept all the lower arms and everything. I just put a few poly bushes and stuff where it didn't have them. As I said in the previous episode, it had Group A top mounts already, so we kept all those. We kept the strut braces and everything that had been fabricated for it. So the suspension didn't change a lot. We kept the Bilstein dampers on the front. I actually switched to gas on the rear because the Bilsteins were totally knackered, and I could get the gas quickly, and it just kind of made sense at the time. So didn't make any major changes suspension-wise. Going back to the very beginning of this video, though, I talked about brakes, didn't I? I ummed and ahed a lot about the brakes, but we actually ended up sticking with the 17-inch wheel concept in the end, and that allowed me to fit much bigger brakes. And they came from a Mark I Ford Focus RS, kind of. So I used Focus RS discs, which are 325mm, I want to say. And the brake calipers were actually from a Fiat Coupe Turbo 20 valve, but I believe they are identical to the ones on the Focus RS. And you could get adapter brackets to make those fit onto the Escort hub. So that was a relatively bolt-on conversion, and made the brakes a lot better. The other thing we did to the brakes, what I did to the brakes, was change the pedal box. So when I bought the car, it still had the servo, and the brakes were basically standard apart from it had a hydraulic handbrake fitted. But I wanted to learn how to drive a car without a brake servo. So I managed to get a reproduction of a Group A Formula 2 Escort pedal box from a friend of mine who owns an Escort Maxi, and I thought that would be a relatively easy thing to fit, but as he discovered when he built his car, because it's right-hand drive, it's actually quite difficult to fit a Group A pedal box into a right-hand drive Escort shell because it was designed for left-hand drive. And if you think about it, on a left-hand drive car, the pedal box is all behind the gearbox, and the way that the bulkhead is shaped and everything, it just gives you a lot more clearance, whereas if everything's on the right, the pedal box ends up behind the engine, and it just gets a bit messy with the wiper linkage and everything. So it was a bit of a faff to get it to fit, but it went in, and it ended up being relatively neat. So we had a bias pedal box, which did come back to bite me when I did the first event, but that's another story. And we had the Brembo brakes on the front with 325mm discs, kept the rear brakes as they were, kept the hydraulic handbrake as it was, just redid all the brake lines and everything while I was there, just to kind of tidy it up on this continuing mission that I was on to try and make the car just cleaner and tidier. So I think that covers most of the mechanical stuff. Like I said, it was really just a case of trying to improve the car, make it lighter and just make it a bit neater. You know, if you look in the engine bay, I'll put a picture up now of the engine bay of the car as it was when I bought it and one when I'd finished it. And I just wanted to clean it up. So obviously you can see the engine and thing was tidier, it was painted and all that stuff. But by switching to the Group A engine mount, that cleaned up a bit of space kind of behind the engine because there wasn't as many brackets. You know, there was less gearbox mounts because the Focus gearbox only uses 2 mounts. The header tank ended up on the bulkhead to keep it out of harm's way. Got rid of the big plastic factory tank. You know, the power steering reservoir was from a Sierra and that was moved up onto the bulkhead to save a bit of space. A lot of the heater, you know, you have this sort of fake bulkhead in the engine bay of a standard car, that was all gone, and it was just about getting it all cleaned up. So the engine bay was actually one of my favourite bits of the car visually because it just looked way tidier than it had originally. You know, I put a catch can and just a few little bits on there. Battery was moved inside the car, which cleared a load of space. So I think the engine bay kind of shows kind of what the build was all about in a way. It was just about making the car as clean as possible, simple, and just made it easier to get to things and easier to change things. And you know, having the new wiring loom, so everything was nicely braided, and it just meant that you could fault find much more easily. So in that respect, you know, it just improved the car a lot. And it was a journey, I'm not going to lie. I think the main thing that I want to take from this video is that it was a journey. I bought the car in 2012 and did the first event in 2019. It was 6 years. It was the end of 2012 when I bought the car, and obviously early 2019 when I did the first event. It basically took 6 years. For the first year or so, the car wasn't stored at home, so I didn't have access to it. And then it got moved, and it's such a long job. Anyone who's done a big project will tell you that it takes way longer than you expect, costs way more than you expect, and it just becomes, at times it can feel like a huge burden, especially when you're trying to do everything yourself. You're doing it on a driveway instead of in a nice warm garage. You know, it was an undertaking, put it that way. And I think it's a classic case of project creep, isn't it? You know, I think I had this idea to buy the car and use it as it was, and it just got more and more complicated because the more I dug into the car, the more I found that I wanted to change, and the more it just escalated. Every job turned into, oh well, I've done this, you could just do that as well. So it was yeah, classic project creep, overstepping the boundary, going too far, doing too much, not knowing when to say stop. So it definitely went too far. But I think the end result was okay. You know, it got to a point, I think it was late 2018, where I could finally start the car. So Matt, who'd done the wiring loom, he came down, we checked everything over because there was a couple of issues with it, and corrected those, and then the car finally started. And then it was it was a wait after that because we had this clutch issue that obviously we couldn't test until we got the engine running. But you know, starting the car was a big moment. I have to put a video in that right now of that moment because that was a big deal. And you know, that was kind of the beginning of the end, I suppose, of getting the car to the first event. And speaking of that first event, I think that is probably where we should bring this to a close, isn't it? And save that story for episode 3. So I understand that I've been waffling on a lot in this one. There was a lot to get through, lots and lots to talk about in terms of building the car. It was a very long process. I could have spoken for hours about each step and everything I did. As I said, if you've got any questions about anything specific that you've seen in the pictures, just ask and I will try and answer. If you're interested in Escorts and certain things, if you've got one and you're trying to do some stuff yourself. It was a long time ago, but I've got lots of pictures and I'll do my best to help. But I think, yes, let's leave the story of the first event and kind of what happened next for the final part. That had its own challenges, and if we're honest, was a complete nightmare. So that is definitely an episode in itself, and then what happened after that and what has happened to the car since then. So let's wrap it up there. Thank you very much for watching again. If you've enjoyed these videos, please like, comment and subscribe and share them. As I said, if you haven't watched the first episode, do go and do that. and I will see you again for the third and final episode, which will launch on Monday. Thanks for watching.